My name is Marin Castellano, and I'm 33. The week after we moved my grandmother into the memory care wing, my father slid a printed invoice across my kitchen table. $38,000, your share of grandma. Typed out clean with a due date, like a phone bill. I read it twice. I set my coffee down, and I told him I'd look it over. That was the whole of it. I didn't raise my voice. I rinsed my cup, and I walked him to the door. What he never once stopped to think about, what none of them thought about in all those years, is that I am the kind of person who keeps everything. Every receipt, every transfer. Every Sunday, I drove 90 minutes each way to sit with her. 4 years of it, written down in a green ledger, I never once mentioned at a single family dinner. My father wanted a number out of me. He had no idea that in about 6 months, a courtroom was going to read him mine, out loud, with his own name attached to it. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people keep the receipts long after everyone else stops counting. If a story like this has ever sat in your own family, leave a comment and hit subscribe. It tells me which ones to keep telling. People who walk into my bakery for the first time always say the same thing, and they say it like it's a compliment. It's so calm in here. It is calm. That's not an accident. I get to the shop on Grandin Road at 4 in the morning before the streetlights cut off, and I do the same things in the same order every day. Proof the dough I retarded overnight. Fire the oven. Weigh the flour for the day's batches on a scale I trust more than most people. By the time the first customer pushes the door open and the bell does its small tin sound, the whole room smells like bread, and nobody can tell that I've already been awake for hours doing arithmetic. The arithmetic is the part nobody sees. The bread is the part they thank me for. I have run that shop for 9 years. I am not famous in Roanoke, and I don't want to be. I rent a 1-bedroom over on the south side. I drive a 14-year-old hatchback that I keep alive out of pure stubbornness, and I put almost everything that's left over into 2 places, the business and my grandmother. If you'd asked anyone in my family back then what Marin does, they'd have said, oh, she has that little bakery, with a softness on the word little that told you exactly where they ranked it. My sister Renata sells real estate and wears the kind of watch that announces itself. My father, Gus, spent 30 years as a regional sales manager and never once let a holiday go by without reminding the table how many people reported to him. Next to all that, a woman who gets up at 4 to bake was, in the family's telling, the one who hadn't quite figured her life out yet. I let them think it. It cost me nothing, and it kept the peace, and I had learned a long time ago that peace in my family was a thing you paid for in silence. The center of my actual life, the person the whole shape of it bent toward, was my grandmother. Her name is Lucille, but I have never once called her that. To me, she was always Nana. She raised 3 kids in a narrow house on Maple, buried a husband young, and held a job at the textile mill until the mill closed, and then held 2 jobs after that. She taught me to bake. Not the fancy stuff, the bread. She used to say bread doesn't lie to you. You either give it the time or you don't, and it tells everyone the truth about which one you chose. I think about that almost every morning. I think it's the truest thing anyone ever said to me, and I think she meant it about more than dough. When Nana started slipping, small things first, the stove left on, the same story told twice in an hour, a check written to a company that didn't exist, I was the one who noticed because I was the one who was there. I want to be careful and fair about this part because it matters later. It is not that my father and my sister didn't love her. I believe in whatever way they were able that they did. It's that loving her and showing up for her turned out to be 2 completely different jobs, and only one of those jobs had hours. So, I took the hours. I closed the shop a little early on Sundays and made the drive out to Maple, and then later out to the small apartment we found her, and then later still to the place with the keypad on the door. I learned the names of her medications and the dosages and the pharmacist who'd hold them when the refills got tangled. I learned which aide actually showed up and which one billed for visits that never happened, and I fired the second one myself on the phone in the walk-in cooler so my voice wouldn't carry into the shop. I learned the language of geriatric care the way you learn a language by being dropped in the country with no dictionary, badly at first, and then, out of necessity, fluently. And I kept the ledger. This is the part of me my family always found a little embarrassing, the part they'd tease about at dinner if it came up. Marin and her receipts. Marin writes down everything. Marin probably has a folder for her folders, it's true. I do. It's a green spiral ledger, the cheap kind from the office supplies store, and I started it the first month I began covering things for Nana because the numbers were getting too big to hold in my head, and I needed to know, honestly, whether I could afford what I'd taken on. Date, what it was for, what it cost, who I paid. The aide. The pharmacy. The plumber for the burst pipe on Maple. The deposit on the memory care wing, which I want you to remember because it comes back. Page after page, in a hand that gets neater when I'm worried, which is most of the time. By the time my father printed me that invoice, the green ledger had 4 years in it. 4 years, and a total at the bottom that I knew to the dollar without looking because I am the kind of person who knows. He didn't know I had it. None of them did. To them, I was just the daughter who hadn't done as well as her sister, the one who baked, the one who drove out to Maple because, well, she had the time. I had the time because I made the time. That distinction was about to matter more than any of us understood. The first crack didn't look like a betrayal. It looked like a kindness, which is how the good ones always start. It was a Sunday in March, and my father called me, which by itself was unusual enough that my hands went still on the counter when his name came up. He wanted to get organized about Nana. Those were his words. He said, very reasonably, that with her in memory care now, the family ought to be on the same page about money, that it wasn't fair for things to be lopsided, that we should all sit down. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I'd been waiting 4 years for someone in that family to want to sit down about money. We sat down 2 weeks later, the 4 of us, my father, my Aunt Diane, my sister Anata, and me, around Diane's dining table with a plate of cookies nobody touched. And what I slowly understood, as the conversation went on in its calm and reasonable voices, was that the meeting was not for figuring out the truth. The meeting was for ratifying a story that had already been agreed on without me. The story was this. The family had been carrying Nana's care together, as families do, and I, busy with the bakery, you understand, and never the most communicative, had been somewhat absent from the financial side. Now that she was placed, it was time to true everyone up. My father had run the numbers. He'd totaled what the family had spent and divided it fairly, and my portion came to $38,000. I remember the exact moment because something in my chest went very quiet, the way the shop goes quiet at 4 a.m. before I turn anything on. I asked, keeping my voice level, what spending he meant. All of it, Marin, he said, gently, like I was the one being difficult. The home. The aides. Her medications. It adds up. We've all been chipping in. It's only fair everyone carries the same weight. I looked at my aunt. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She was very busy with a cookie she wasn't eating. I looked at my sister, who said, in the warm tone people use right before they side against you, nobody's blaming you. We just want it even. That's all anyone wants. Here is what I did not do. I did not pull out my phone. I did not say I have every receipt. I did not say the word ledger. I have thought 100 times about why I stayed silent in that room, and the honest answer is that some part of me, older than my temper, recognized that I was holding the only true thing on the table, and that you do not show a true thing to people who have already decided to build on a false one. You wait. You let them finish building. So I told them I'd need to look at the numbers, and my father said of course, and a week later the invoice arrived. Printed. Itemized. A due date. Your share of grandma, with a memo line, as if she were a utility. I want to be fair to my father here, the way the truth deserves. He is not a cartoon. He genuinely believed, I think, that he was being a good steward, that organizing the money was leadership, that putting a number on it made him the responsible one. He had told the story so many times, first to himself and then to the others, that it had hardened into fact in his mouth. When I'd see him in those months, he wasn't cruel to me. He'd clap my shoulder and say, you'll get it sorted, you always land on your feet, and mean it as encouragement. The reasonable voice is the most disorienting thing in the world because it makes you wonder, briefly, whether you're the unreasonable one. But there were 2 facts the reasonable voice could not explain, and they sat in my stomach like cold stones. The first, I had paid those bills. Not chipped in. Paid. The memory care deposit my father listed as a shared family expense. I had wired that deposit myself, from my own account, 11 months earlier, and I had the confirmation number written in green ink. The aide he'd costed out. I'd been cutting those checks for 3 years. There was no we. There was me and a ledger and a bank that remembered everything I did. The second fact was worse, and it took me longer to let myself see it, because seeing it meant thinking about my father in a way a daughter doesn't wanna. A few months before the invoice, the family had quietly gone to court and had my father named Nana's conservator, the person legally in charge of her money. They'd framed it to me, when they mentioned it at all, as a formality. Asterisk, someone has to be able to sign things, Marin. It's just paperwork. Asterisk, and maybe it would have stayed paperwork. But I was the one who still drove out every Sunday, and I was the one who noticed when the little things at the facility started going unpaid, a late notice on her account, a hold on her pharmacy, the activities fee that bounced. I noticed because I noticed everything. And a conservator's whole job is that those things do not happen. The back of my neck prickled the first time I saw the late notice. By the third one, my hands had gone cold holding the envelope. I didn't accuse anyone. I am not built that way. And besides, an accusation is a thing you make when you don't have proof, and you're hoping to shake some loose. I had the opposite problem. I had proof, mine anyway, and I had a growing, careful suspicion that somewhere in my father's conservator accounting there was a hole, and that the invoice he'd handed me was not really a bill at all. It was a story he needed to be true. If I owed the family $38,000, then the family had spent $38,000, and nobody would think to ask too closely where it had actually gone. So, I did the only thing I have ever really known how to do when the ground gets uncertain. I went home, and I opened the ledger, and I started building the other story, the true one, page by page, transfer by transfer, until it was complete enough to stand up on its own in front of someone whose job was to care about nothing but which version was real. I didn't tell my father. I didn't tell my sister. I told one person, and only because the law required me to, a court. Because here's the thing about a conservatorship that my father, in all his organizing, had forgotten. A conservator does not get to keep the money quietly. A conservator has to account for it. And courts, every so often, sit down and review that accounting in a room with a door and a judge and anyone with standing who chooses to show up. I had standing. I had Sundays. And I had a green ledger. I requested the date for the review. Then I went back to the shop, and I baked, and I waited for the morning a stranger in a robe would finally ask the only question my family had spent 4 years refusing to. Who actually paid? The review is set for a morning in early autumn, in a courthouse downtown that smells like floor wax and old radiators, no matter the season. I had been in that building exactly once before, years earlier, to renew a permit for the bakery, and I remember thinking even then that it was a building designed to make you feel small and orderly at the same time, which I suppose is the point. I want to tell you how I got ready because the getting ready is the whole story of who I am. I did not hire a dramatic lawyer. I could not have afforded one, and more than that, I didn't think the truth needed a performance. I thought it needed a clean presentation. I retained a quiet, semi-retired attorney named Mr. Okafor, whose entire manner suggested a man who had seen every kind of family money go wrong and was no longer surprised by any of it. He looked at my green ledger for a long time, turning the pages slowly, and then he looked at the bank records I'd printed and tabbed, and then he set them down and said, "You kept all of this." It wasn't a question. I said I keep everything. He almost smiled. That, he said, is going to be a problem for someone, but not for you. I assembled it the way I assemble a morning's bake. The ledger. 4 years of bank statements, with every relevant line highlighted and cross-referenced to a ledger page. The wire confirmation for the memory care deposit, the one my father had listed as a shared family cost, with my name on the sending account and his nowhere on it. The canceled checks to the aide. The pharmacy autopay. And this is the piece I had not gone looking for, the piece that found me, a manila folder Nana had given me herself, for years earlier, on a clear afternoon before the slipping got bad, when she still knew exactly what she wanted, and exactly who she trusted to carry it out. I'll come back to that folder. You'll know when. I got to the courthouse early, the way I get to the shop early, because being early is the only superstition I allow myself. I sat on a hard bench in the hallway, with a folder of records on my lap, and one by one my family arrived. My Aunt Diane came first, in a good coat, and gave me a small nod that was trying to be warm and landed somewhere near nervous. My sister Renata came next on the phone, the way she is always on the phone, and she pressed it to her shoulder long enough to say, "I really wish you'd just talk to us, Marin, instead of making it this," and then went back to her call before I could answer, which was just as well, because I didn't have an answer that wouldn't have started a fight, and I had decided weeks before that I was not going to fight. The room was going to do that for me. My father came last. He came in like a man arriving at a meeting he was confident he'd chair, easy in the shoulders, a court binder under his arm that I recognized, because I'd seen him carry binders like it into sales reviews my whole childhood. He saw me on the bench. He came over. He sat down beside me, close, in the way fathers do when they're about to manage you, and he said, low and reasonable, "You don't have to be here for this, you know. It's just a formality. I've got it handled." And then, because he could not help himself, because the reasonable voice always trips over its own confidence eventually, "Did you bring something for the 38? We can settle it after and not drag the court into family business." I looked at the folder on my lap. I looked at my father. "I brought everything," I said. He didn't understand the sentence. Why would he? He patted my knee, stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked into the courtroom carrying a story he'd told so many times he'd forgotten it was only ever a story. Inside, the room was smaller than the movies make them. A handful of benches, a clerk, a court-appointed examiner, a careful woman named Ms. Reyes whose job, I would learn, was to scrutinize exactly the kind of accounting my father had filed. And at the front, the judge. An older man with reading glasses pushed down his nose, and the unbothered patience of someone who has watched a great many families discover, in his courtroom, that the version of events they arrived with is not the version they will leave with. My father presented first because he was the conservator, and this was his accounting to defend. He was good. I'll give him that, with no bitterness. He was genuinely good, warm and organized, walking the court through a tidy narrative of a family pulling together to care for its matriarch, of expenses shared, of a daughter who, regrettably, had not been as involved on the financial side as everyone had hoped, but whom they did not wish to shame. He used my name kindly. He used the word fair 4 times. I counted because I am the kind of person who counts. And then the judge looked at me over his glasses and asked if I wished to be heard. That was the freeze beat, though it didn't feel dramatic in a moment. It felt like 4 a.m. The whole room had been moving in my father's direction, carried along by the reasonable voice, and then it simply stopped. Stopped and turned, all those faces, toward the daughter on the back bench with a folder on her lap. My aunt's hand had gone to her collar. My sister had, for once, put her phone face down. And my father, half turned in his chair, wore an expression I had never seen on him in 33 years, the specific stillness of a confident man who has just felt, without yet understanding why, the floor move under him. I stood up. My pulse was knocking in my throat, but my hands, holding the folder, were perfectly steady. They always are. That's the part of me my family never learned to read. "I do," I said. "I'd like to be heard." I did not raise my voice. I have never raised my voice in my life, and I wasn't going to start in a room with a flag in the corner. I just laid it out the way I lay out a morning. I told the court I had been the one paying my grandmother's care for 4 years, and that I could show every dollar of it. Then I handed Ms. Reyes, the examiner, the green ledger and the tabbed bank statements, and I asked the court to do one simple thing: compare what my father's accounting said the family had spent against what the bank records showed had actually been spent, and by whom. It took the room a while to feel what was happening, because the truth, unlike the reasonable voice, doesn't perform. It just accumulates. Ms. Reyes started turning pages, and the courtroom got very quiet, and into that quiet she began, every so often, to say a number out loud, and then a name. The memory care deposit my father had listed as a shared family expense, $11,000. Paid by wire. From Marin Castellano's account. She held up the confirmation, my name printed on it, his name nowhere. The aid, 3 years of checks. Marin Castellano. The pharmacy autopay. Marin Castellano. Line after line, the same name, until the name stopped sounding like mine and started sounding like a verdict. Then she turned to my father's side of it. And this is where the morning stopped being about me at all. Because when she lined his claimed expenses against the conservatorship's own bank records, the account he controlled, the account he was legally required to account for, the numbers didn't meet. There were withdrawals that didn't match any care she'd received. There was the matter of the facility's late notices, 3 of them, on a resident whose conservator had certified there were ample funds. And there was, at the bottom, a gap of roughly $26,000 between what had gone out of my grandmother's account under my father's signature and what had ever reached the people who cared for her. I watched my father's face do the thing I will remember longest. It went the color of paper. Not all at once, in stages, the way a wall takes water. He started to stand, and the judge said, without heat, "Sit down, sir." And he sat, and the binder in his hands had begun, very slightly, to shake. He tried the reasonable voice one more time, because it was the only instrument he had ever needed. "Your Honor, families keep records differently. I'd have to go back through." And the judge let him finish, and then said the gentlest, devastating sentence I have ever heard. "Mr. Castellano, the records aren't in dispute. The banks are the only ones that count, and they're in front of me." My aunt made a small sound. My sister had both hands flat on the bench in front of her, like a woman steadying herself on a boat. Nobody looked at me. They were all looking at him, and I understood, standing there with my steady hands, that I had not done a single thing to my father. I had only stopped holding up the false thing, and the false thing had fallen on its own, the way they always do, given enough weight. And then I gave the court the folder. I debated whether to. The receipts had already done the work. My father's accounting was already on the floor. But the receipts only proved who paid. They did not prove who Nana had chosen, and the choosing was the part of this that I think she would have wanted said out loud in a room, with everyone present. So I handed it up. Inside that manila folder were 3 documents my grandmother had signed for years earlier, on a clear afternoon at her kitchen table on Maple, with a notary my pharmacist had recommended, while she still knew her own mind down to the last corner of it. A durable financial power of attorney, naming me. A healthcare directive, naming me. And a single page in her own hand, the mill worker's careful cursive I would know anywhere, that the judge read aloud, because Mr. Okafor asked him to, and because the court agreed it spoke to her intent. It was short. She wrote that she wanted Marin to look after her affairs, because Marin was the one who showed up, and that if anyone ever asked who she trusted with her money and her care, the answer was written down here, so there'd be no arguing about it later. She'd dated it. She'd signed it Lucille Castellano in full, the only time I have ever seen her use her whole name. The judge read it in an even voice, and when he finished, he took his glasses off, and the room held its breath the way a kitchen holds the smell of bread. The conservatorship had been granted to my father on the family's word that no such arrangement existed. It had, all along. She had made her choice while she was still herself, and the family had gone to court and built a different one over the top of it, and my father had spent down the difference. The judge did not shout. Validators never have to. He simply said that the accounting was unacceptable, that the court would be removing Mr. Castellano as conservator effective immediately, that a full forensic accounting of the conservatorship would be ordered, and that the documents executed by Ms. Lucille Castellano 4 years prior would be given the weight she had clearly intended them to have. Then he looked at me, the granddaughter on the back bench with the cheap green ledger, and asked whether I was willing to serve. I said I was. I had been for 4 years. The only thing that had changed was that now it was written down somewhere besides my own 2 hands. I didn't gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. My grandmother was still in a memory care wing, and a man I had loved my whole life was sitting 4 feet away with his world coming apart in stages, and none of that is the kind of thing a decent person celebrates. I gathered my folder. I thanked the court. And then I did the most ordinary thing in the world. I drove home, 90 minutes the other direction for once, and I let myself into the dark shop and I turned on the oven and I made a single loaf for nobody because my hands needed something true to do. A thing my family never understood about me is that I don't run on momentum. After the courtroom, there was no triumphant scene, no confrontation on a lawn, no speech. There was just the slow machinery of consequence turning, and me going to work every morning while it turned. The forensic accounting took months. I learned more about my father's finances in that stretch than I had learned in 33 years of being his daughter, and almost none of it was the kind of thing you want to know. The $26,000 gap was not, it turned out, a single dramatic theft. It was worse. In its way, it was ordinary. It was a man under more pressure than he ever let the table see, treating his mother's conservatorship account the way a drowning person treats a railing, as something to hold on to, just for now, just until things turned around. A car payment here, a credit card balance there. The country club dues he could no longer admit he couldn't afford. Each one small, each one reasonable in his own telling, each one a brick in the false thing he'd handed me, an invoice to help support. The $38,000 bill made sense to me, finally, the way a confession makes sense once you know the crime. If I owed the family, then the family had spent, and no one would look at the account too closely. I was supposed to be the cover. The court ordered him to repay what the accounting found. I won't pretend I know whether he ever fully will. These things grind on long after the cameras would have cut away. What I do know is what it cost him in the only currency my father ever truly valued, which was standing. The country club was the first to go quiet. Then the men he golfed with. Then, slowly, the version of himself he'd spent a lifetime selling, the regional manager, the one who organized things, the one in charge. You cannot keep being the man in charge once a courtroom has read aloud, in front of your own family, the precise distance between what you said and what you did. His shoulders changed. The next time I saw him, months later, the easy set of them was gone, and he looked, for the first time in my life, like a person who knew he had been seen all the way through. My sister was the first to call. Renata, who had told me in the hallway that she wished I'd just talked to them. She didn't apologize. Renata has never in her life used the actual words, but she called, and her voice had gone careful in a way I'd never heard, and she asked if we could find a way forward as a family. What she meant, I understood after a few minutes, was that she was frightened. Frightened of being associated with it. Frightened of what the forensic accounting might say about money that had passed through her hands too. Frightened in the specific way of a person who has always managed her image and just watched a family member's image dismantled in public. She said near the end, "You always were the responsible one, Marin." She said it like a compliment. She meant it like an apology she couldn't afford to make directly. I told her the same thing I tell my doe. It takes the time it takes. I didn't slam a door. I just didn't open one all the way either. My Aunt Diane called next and then again, and then she started calling weekly. Diane's calls were the hardest, because Diane is not a bad woman, she's a frightened one, and the frightened ones cling. She wanted access. She wanted to know I wasn't going to cut the family off from Nana now that I held the directive and soon the conservatorship. Her voice would climb and tighten. "Please, Marin, she's my mother too. You can't keep us from her." And I had to be very steady on those calls, because the temptation to use the thing I now held, to make them feel, even for an afternoon, the smallness they'd assigned to me for years, was real, and it sat right there in my hand. I want to tell you, I was never tempted. That would be a lie, and Nana hated a lie more than anything. I was tempted. But I thought about that single page in her careful cursive. Marin is the one who shows up, and I understood that she had not chosen me to be a gate. She had chosen me to be a door that stayed open to the people who actually loved her, even the frightened ones, even the ones who'd gotten it wrong. So I told Diane the truth, that I would never keep her from her mother, that the directive was about who managed the care, not about who got to love her, and that she was welcome at the facility any Sunday she cared to show up. There was a long pause on the line. Then, quietly, she said she'd come. And, to her credit, the only real credit in this story besides Nana's, she did. She started showing up. Not every Sunday, but some. And showing up, as I have said, is the whole of it. The pleading I never expected came last, and it came from my father, and it did not come the way I'd have imagined. He didn't ask for money. Whatever else he is, he had too much pride left for that, and the court had taken the question out of his hands anyway. What he asked for, on a gray afternoon in the bakery after the last customer had gone and I was wiping down the case, was something I didn't have a ledger line for. He stood near the door with his hands in his coat pockets, like a man who didn't know if he was allowed to come further in, and he said he wanted to see her. Nah. He said he hadn't been out to the facility in weeks because he didn't know if he was permitted, now that everything was, and he gestured vaguely at all of it, the court, the accounting, the wreckage. And then my father, who once reminded every holiday table how many people reported to him, asked his daughter the baker for permission to visit his own mother. My throat tightened. I'm not made of stone, whatever my family decided years ago. I told him the same thing I told Diane, that I would never keep him from her, that she was his mother, and he could go any time, and that I'd let the front desk know he was welcome. He nodded. He looked around the shop, really looked at it, maybe for the first time, the clean cases and the calm I'd built with my own hands at 4 a.m, and he said, "You did a good job with this place." It was not an apology. My father may never manage an apology. Some people's pride outlives everything else they own. But it was the closest he had ever come to seeing me, and I decided to let it be enough, because waiting for the perfect apology from the people who hurt you is just another way of letting them keep the time that belongs to you. I served as Nana's conservator from then on, which mostly meant doing out in the open with the court's blessing, exactly what I'd been doing quietly for 4 years. The accounting was clean because it had always been clean. Ms. Reyes told me once, dryly, that mine was the easiest review she'd done in a decade, and I told her it was because I'm the kind of person who keeps everything, and she said, yes. I noticed. Nana's house on Maple, the narrow one she raised 3 kids in, worth a little under $300,000 in a town like ours, was hers still, held safe now, the deed clear, no one's railing to grab in a panic. I kept it in good repair the way she'd have wanted. And every Sunday, the way I have for years, I drove out and sat with her. Some days she knew me all the way through. Some days she knew me the way you know a song without the words. Either way, I'd bring her a roll from that morning's bake, still a little warm if I'd timed the drive right, and she'd hold it in both hands and breathe it in, and I'd watch something settle in her face, and I'd think, bread doesn't lie to you. You either give it the time, or you don't. She gave me everything she had. The least I could do was give her the time. People who hear how this ended sometimes ask me about the courtroom, the reveal, my father's face going to paper. They want the moment the false thing fell. But the moment was never the real story. The real story was the 4 years before it, the ones nobody was watching, and if I'm going to tell this honestly, I have to tell you about those, because the courtroom only worked because the years were already true.
Let me tell you about the pipe.
It was February, 2 winters into all of it, and the pipe under Nana's kitchen sink on Maple let go in the middle of the night. She called me, not my father, not Diane, me, at 1 a.m, and the thing that turned my stomach wasn't the water. It was that she couldn't quite explain what was happening. The slipping was further along than the family wanted to admit, and on the phone she kept saying the floor is wrong. Marin, the floor is wrong, and I got dressed in the dark and drove the 90 minutes with my hands cold on the wheel the whole way. I shut the water off. I mopped the floor at 3 a.m. I sat with her until she stopped being frightened, and then I made coffee in her old percolator, and we watched it get light through the kitchen window, and she patted my hand and said, "You're a good girl. Don't tell your father I scared you." I wrote it all down later. The plumber, $400. The water-damaged cabinet, $200 more. Date, what it was for, what it cost, who I paid.
Me.
Always me. But you can't put a line in a ledger for drove 90 minutes in the dark because my grandmother thought the floor was wrong. There's no column for that. There never is. That's the whole problem with the way families keep score. The things that matter most don't fit in the ledger, and so the people who do them get counted as having done nothing at all. Let me tell you about Donna, the aide. The first aide we hired seemed fine, warm even, and for 3 months I paid her without thinking twice because that's what you do. You trust the person caring for someone you love. But I'm the kind of person who reconciles. End of every month, I sit with the statements and the calendar, and I make the numbers agree. And 1 month the numbers didn't agree. Donna had billed for 2 Tuesday visits Nana had spent at a doctor's appointment I'd driven her to myself.
Small.
Easy to miss. The kind of thing that slides right past a family that loves from a distance. It didn't slide past me, because nothing slides past me. That's not a virtue, exactly. It's closer to a condition. I checked the prior months. The pattern was there once you looked. I called Donna from the walk-in cooler at the bakery so my voice wouldn't carry, and I kept it level, and I let her go, and I logged the overpayment and went back out to the front and pulled a tray of rolls like nothing had happened. I never told the family. What would I have said? They already thought my receipts were a personality flaw. It did not occur to a single one of them that the same trait they teased me for was the only thing standing between my grandmother and the slow, quiet bleed that happens to old people whose money is watched by no one. The back of my neck still prickles when I think about how close it came, in those years, to no one watching at all. Let me tell you about the birthday. It was my father's 60th, a real event. Renata had it catered. There was a slideshow. I came. I always came. And somewhere around the toasts, my father stood up and gave a speech about family, about how proud he was of the people he'd raised, and he talked about Renata's success and her drive, and he talked about how the family always pulls together, and he never once said my name. Not out of cruelty. He simply didn't think of me as part of the sentence. I sat there with a glass I wasn't drinking from and felt my jaw set, and across the table my aunt caught my eye and gave me a little sympathetic wince, as if to say you know how he is, which is the thing families say instead of fixing anything. And here is what I did. I checked my watch, and I realized if I left right then I could make it out to the facility before Nana's bedtime, and I could bring her a slice of the cake.
So I did.
I slipped out during the slideshow. Nobody noticed me go. That's not self-pity, it's just true. The responsible one is the easiest person in any room to not notice, and I drove out with a slice of my father's 60th birthday cake on the passenger seat, and I fed it to my grandmother with a plastic fork, and she said it was too sweet, and we laughed about that, and it was, hand to God, the best part of the whole day. I have never once regretted leaving that party. I think about it now, and something in my chest goes warm and still at the same time, the way it does when you know you spent an hour exactly where it counted. Let me tell you what it cost me, because this is the part people skip, and it's the part that makes the rest mean anything. For years of carrying Nana's care came to a little over $41,000 out of my own pocket, and I ran a bakery, not a brokerage. That money came from somewhere. It came from the commercial oven I limped along on 3 years past when I should have replaced it, babying a heating element that any sane owner would have swapped out. It came from a trip I'd been saving for and quietly stopped saving for. It came from 1,000 small no's I said to myself and never explained to anyone, because explaining would have meant telling the family what I was actually doing, and telling them would have invited exactly the kind of organizing my father eventually did anyway. I chose to carry it alone. I want to be honest that it was a choice, and that the silence was part of the choice, and that the silence is the reason the invoice could even exist. If I'd waved every receipt around at every dinner, no one could have pretended I'd done nothing. But I didn't want credit. I wanted my grandmother cared for, and I wanted peace, and I told myself those two things were enough. They were enough, right up until the morning my father tried to charge me for them. That's the moment people don't understand. Why I didn't explode in Diane's dining room. Why I sat there with my hands still while they divided up a bill for work I'd already done. I've thought about it more than anything else in this whole story. And the closest I can get is this. I had spent 4 years learning that my family did not believe what I said, only what they could see. Words bounced off them. A daughter saying I paid for that was just noise. They had a story, and the story was louder. So I made a decision in the space of a held breath, sitting at that table, that I was done trying to be believed. I was going to be proven. There is a difference, and it is the difference between an argument and a record. An argument my family could win because they had the numbers and the volume and each other. A record they could not touch because a record does not care who's in charge or who has the watch or who reports to whom. A record only knows what happened. And I had 4 years of what happened, in green ink, in a hand that gets neater when I'm worried. So I let them build. I let my father print the invoice. I let the family agree it was fair. I let the conservatorship sit there, unquestioned, gathering its quiet whole. I let all of it harden into the most confident version of itself because I understood, the way I understand that the more confident the false thing gets, the harder it falls when the true thing finally stands up next to it. You don't interrupt someone who's building their own undoing. You hand them the level when they're done, and let the wall show you it was never plumb. The afternoon Nana signed the folder is the one I come back to most. It was years before any of this. A clear afternoon, the slipping just beginning but her mind still sharp enough that day to cut glass. She'd asked me to bring the notary my pharmacist trusted, and she sat at her kitchen table on maple in her good cardigan and signed 3 documents in her careful millworker's cursive, and when it was done she capped the pen and looked at me a long moment and said, "I'm not doing this to start a fight, Marin. I'm doing it to end one before it gets going." I didn't fully understand her then. I thought she was being dramatic, the way the old sometimes are about their own arrangements. I tucked the folder in a drawer and didn't think about it for years. She understood her own children better than I did. She knew exactly what would happen the moment she couldn't speak for herself, knew which way the family would tilt, knew who'd organize and who'd go along, and who'd quietly carry the actual weight. She wrote it all down so there'd be no arguing later because Marin is the one who shows up. She built her own record the same way I build mine, and I never knew until a judge read it aloud that the thing I do, the keeping, the writing, the reconciling, I learned from her. It was hers before it was mine. She just gave it the time, and it told everyone the truth about which one of us she'd chosen, long after she could no longer say it herself. That's what the quiet years looked like. Not a courtroom. A pipe at 1 a.m, a slice of cake on a passenger seat, an oven I should have replaced, a folder in a drawer. The courtroom was just the morning all of it finally added up out loud. It's been a while now since the courtroom, long enough that the dust has settled into something you could call a life again, and people always want to know how it all shook out, whether there was a reckoning, whether anyone changed, whether I got some grand moment of vindication beyond the one in the robe and the glasses. The honest answer is the unglamorous one. Things just rearrange themselves around the truth, slowly, the way a river finds the lower ground once you stop damming it. My father pays back what the court ordered a little every month, and I don't track those payments, which is funny if you know me because I track everything. But that ledger isn't mine to keep. The court keeps it. I made a decision early that I was not going to become the woman who watches her father's repayments tick down like a scoreboard, because that's just the invoice running the other direction, and I didn't beat the invoice in order to become it.
He visits Nana now.
Not often, old habits, old pride, but he goes and the front desk waves him through because I told them to, and once I arrived on a Sunday and his car was already in the lot, and I sat in mine for 10 minutes letting him have the visit to himself, because some things a man should get to do without his daughter watching. When he came out he saw me, and we stood in the parking lot a while, 2 people who'd run out of the old script and hadn't quite written a new one, and he said the weather was turning, and I agreed that it was. It wasn't warmth, exactly. But it wasn't war. And after the years we'd had, the absence of war felt like a kind of grace. Renata and I are something like cordial. She never did say sorry in words, but last spring she drove down to Roanoke without being asked and spent a Saturday at the facility helping me sort through a box of Nana's old photographs, and she cried at one of them, the 2 of us as little girls in matching dresses Nana had sewn, and she said, not looking at me, "She always did treat you like the real one." I didn't correct her. There wasn't a competition. There never had been, except in the family's head. But I let her say it, and I let it sit between us. And I think for Renata that Saturday was as close to an apology as her particular pride allows, and I've decided to accept the currency people can actually pay in rather than holding out for the currency they can't. Diane shows up most Sundays now. That's the one that surprised me. The frightened ones, sometimes, when the thing they feared finally happens and the world doesn't end, get a little braver. She brings Nana those butterscotch candies she likes, and she's learned the names of the aides, the real ones, and once she said to me, quietly in the hall, I should have looked closer. I just trusted that someone had it handled. Which is the most honest sentence anyone in my family ever said to me, because it's the whole disease in one line. Everyone trusting that someone had it handled, and the someone all along, being a woman they decided didn't count. As for me, I still get to the shop at 4 a.m, and I still do the same things in the same order, and it's still common there, and I still don't want to be famous in Roanoke. The oven finally got replaced. Turns out when you're not quietly carrying $40,000 of someone else's care, there's a little more room in the budget, and the new one holds its heat so steady, I almost don't trust it. I keep the green ledger going out of pure habit. There's nothing dramatic in it anymore, just flour and rent and the ordinary arithmetic of a small business, but I'd no sooner stop keeping it than stop breathing. It's not about catching anyone. It never really was. It's about being the kind of person who knows what's true in a world that would mostly rather you didn't. Let me tell you about a Sunday recently because it's where I'd want this to end if I got to choose. I'd timed the drive right, so the roll in the paper bag on the passenger seat was still warm when I got to the facility. Nana was in the sunroom, in the chair by the window she likes, and it was one of the good days. She knew me all the way through, called me by my name the second I came in, said, "There's my girl." I sat with her and broke the roll in half, and we ate it looking out at the parking lot and the turning trees, and she held her half in both hands the way she always does, and breathed it in before she ate it, and said it was good.
Just that.
It's good, Marin. And something in my chest went quiet and full at the same time, the way the shop goes at 4 a.m. before I turn anything on, when the whole day is still possible and nothing's gone wrong yet. She doesn't know about the courtroom. I never told her, and on the days she slipped too far it wouldn't hold anyway, and on the days she's sharp it would only worry her. She thinks I just come on Sundays because I always have. And maybe that's the truest version of all of it. That under the invoice and the conservatorship and the judge and the folder, the only thing that was ever really happening was a granddaughter driving 90 minutes to bring her grandmother warm bread, the way she taught her to make it. Everything else was just the world catching up to what the two of us had known the whole time. Bread doesn't lie to you. You either give it the time or you don't. I gave it the time. I'd give it again. Here's what those 4 years taught me, and what I'd tell anyone sitting where I sat in that dining room with their hands going still. You don't have to win the argument. You almost never can, not against people who've already agreed on the story. What you can do is keep the record, quietly, faithfully, without needing anyone to see it, and trust that the truth doesn't need your volume, only your patience. The people who count you as nothing are telling you exactly how little they're watching.
Let them.
Keep showing up where it actually matters. Write down what's real, and one day, in some plain room with a tired judge and a flag in the corner, the false thing will stand up to make its case, and the true thing will rise quietly beside it, and the whole room will see at last which one was ever plumb. That's my story. A green ledger, a warm roll, and a folder my grandmother signed years before anyone thought to ask her who she trusted. If your father handed you a bill for the care you were the only one giving, and you had every receipt to prove it, would you have argued it at the table, paid it to keep the peace, or waited and let a courtroom do the talking? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.